Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today, I want to talk about prose. Yay! One of the most exciting aspects of talking about literature. Well, to be fair, I actually really enjoy it. I don't know how much you will. But the reason I want to talk about this, well, I have two major reasons. One, prose to me is one of the central and most important aspects of the written narrative. And because of that, that's why I want to talk about it. The other is the difficulty we have in talking about good prose and bad prose and sort of evaluating what prose is. And I'll deal with, let's start with what is prose, where it comes from, and that might give us an insight into evaluating it. But also then I want to talk about what prose is meant to be doing. And then I'm going to talk about some of the difficulties in evaluation. That's how I'm going to try and divide up this video. So let's first understand what prose is. Because when you think about it, the term prose is incredibly nebulous. A dictionary definition is going to say something along the lines of prose is writing that isn't poetry. And the reason it says that is the word comes from the Latin, and it basically comes from ancient Rome. After they'd pinched a load of stuff from the Greeks, and you had narrative was communicated in poetry, in epic poetry, in an oral fashion. So when you wrote those poems down, when you annotated those poems, and you had all of that thing, that was poetry. And it was regulated. It had all of these different rules and styles. We talk about the meter of a poem, the number of stressed and unstressed syllables in a line, whether it has internal rhyme or external rhyme, the rhyme scheme of things, all of these different aspects, heavily stylized style of writing. Drama, again, it was all about performance, and it fitted into that poetic mode, but it involved multiple people performing it. And again, it was heavily stylized. And prose then was the term used to describe writing in the everyday, writing all other types of writing. And it encompassed things like a letter to a loved one, a set of orders that you were sending to an army, a philosophical treatise on a subject, the note that you left your housekeeper, the bill of sale for your oxen and cart. Now, when you think about that, when you think about a philosopher writing a philosophical treatise on a subject, and you think about a bill of sale, and you think about a legal contract, and you think about orders being sent to the front, are they all written in the same style? No, but they're not written as poetry, typically. Although I am thinking it'd be quite interesting to read, an entire philosophical treatise that just was a series of limericks. So while we think of the term prosaic, relating to the qualities of prose as being everyday language, it actually isn't about making it the same as the standard language that we use. Because clearly it's not about that aspect of the style. It's about it not being a heavily formalized style like poetry. But here's the big thing. Is that definition useful in the modern day? And I would suggest, it's useful as a general thing to go prose isn't poetry, that's fine. But think about it. Defining it that way isn't useful in the modern day because poetry, over the last 2,000 years or so, has actually evolved. There's lots of different styles of poems. You have prose poems. You have all of these different things: sonnets, limericks, haiku, epic poems. The wealth and style of poetry is amazing. And they all have different rules. They all have different ways of expressing themselves. They all use different forms and formats. Like even the sonnet, there are multiple forms of the sonnet. So saying that prose is not poetry is just saying that, yeah, it's a style of writing that isn't as heavily regulated as poetry, but now that definition is far less accurate because there's loads of poems that are kind of like prose, and there's a load of prose that's kind of like poems. So it doesn't really tell us a lot. But then we think, well, we use it for, when we're talking about novels. And you go, oh, yeah, Maybe we should pay attention to when novels were invented, because the novella is what, mid-ish 16th century. But it comes from basically the word novel, new, because it was a new form of storytelling. I don't know about you, but novels have been around for a while. But this was the new form of storytelling. Why was it described as new? Because it wasn't poetry. It wasn't an epic poem. It wasn't an epic narrative, a poetic narrative. It wasn't drama. But it was a way of telling stories in writing, and therefore this was found to be new. So novels from the mid 16th century onwards start playing with the form of what prose is, what prose can do, what prose should do. And there's lots of experimentation. And this is why if someone offers an argument that prose should reflect everyday speech and everyday syntax and everyday grammar, because that's the origin of the word, they're kind of forgetting that 2,000 years have passed and meanings change over time, language changes over time. But it does give us an idea of, the general concept of what we meant by prose. We mean the written word as it is found, and it's a way of telling the story. That's the essence of it. But saying that prose shouldn't be like poetry is not useful. Poetry's changed a lot. Prose has changed a lot. And it's applying a 2,000-year-old definition to the modern day. And that's generally not a good idea. So what do we mean by prose in the modern day? It is the written language that is communicating a narrative. And one of the things that, we hear creative writers talk about is everything should serve the narrative. So as you understand, I've done a whole lot of these different videos talking about different aspects of narrative and how narrative is not just the narrative events, not just the plot. It's not just the story. The story is a way people often use to encapsulate narrative. It's not just the themes. It's not just the characters. It's all of these things, everything together. So how then does prose actually relate to narrative? And this is where, some of the edges start to get blurred, because we have stepped away from a very simple, straightforward definition of it's just the written language that's nothing like poetry, to now, well, no, it's a type of written language that is communicating a narrative. So the first thing is, what sort of narrative? Is it a science fiction story? Is it a fantasy story? Is it a horror story? Is it a ghost story? Is it a slice of life? Is it a detective noir? Is it a gothic noir? Is it a gothic ghost story, fantasy, urban? Can you see why, as soon as we start bringing in an idea that the prose must serve the narrative, we first start then with defining the narrative. And the narrative then is going to be defined by the genre, by the time period in which it is written, by the culture in which the author was inhabiting and when they wrote it. All of these feed into what is this narrative. So we have to appreciate the narrative in order to start dissecting and talking about the prose. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you need to know everything about the author, or you need to know everything about the time period when it is written. But having an appreciation of those things gives you quite often a much better insight into the prose. So let's talk about those aspects of prose. When I'll use fantasy as an example. When we have an epic fantasy story, quite often the world being evoked is in the past. Therefore, one of the ways to do that is to stylistically alter the prose, to give it a texture and a flavor that evokes that sense of the past. That's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it is to choose much less flavorful language, to drop in the odd fantasy reference here and there, but to try and keep your language as simple as possible and try and evoke the fantasy world through different means, through the actual descriptions or through interactions between characters or through plot movements and events. That's another way of doing it. And everywhere in between, there are all these different techniques that you can use to create a sense of a fantasy world. But here's an interesting thing. When a text is written in what we consider modern day English, clear, concise, straightforward, the English of today, in 100 years' time, that is likely to look really old-fashioned, because language changes, language moves on, styles change, styles move on. And that is an incredibly complex interaction of a whole load of different factors. But when we look back at, say, the fiction in the Victorian period, and you look at fiction that is meant to be depicting the working classes and the real life of the hard-working, everyday men and women, and it's written in what certain authors felt was a very straightforward representation of working class life and education. A number of assumptions are being made about it. And yet when we read those texts read quite old-fashioned. They are using old-fashioned language. Sometimes it's quite what we would consider cumbersome, that it is overly embellished, that maybe that style appears somewhat overwritten. Because in comparison to today, the style of everyday language that was perfectly appropriate to reflect the everyday language of the Victorian working classes was a very different style of English than the one that we use now. And so we contrast our knowledge with what we are being shown. Our knowledge of today, this is how language should function. This is what clear and precise and concise language is. And we look at the Victorian version of it and go, well, that's a bit overly elaborate. But that denies the context in which it is written. So do we judge the prose based on our default, as we are now, or do we judge it on the default of the time period? Because those are two different standards. So that is something to bear in mind. Now, that is when we're dealing with mimetic fiction, when we're dealing with the real world. So if we have a story, and again, we're going to deal with mimetic fiction. Let's stay away from fantasy and science fiction and all these things just for a moment. If we're dealing with mimetic fiction, and it is a story set today, and it is about a scrappy young reporter working in London, trying to solve or crack a case and get the scoop on a story, that might be written in a style reflective of the age of the central protagonist. It is a style that might reflect the fact that they are newspaper reporters. They're going for a more reportage style. And it'll be written in a cultural idiom that, well, potentially, that will be more about British English and UK English, and using that style of spelling or certain phrases and words that are common in the UK. Now, if we then move it to New York and tell exactly the same story, set in exactly the same time period as in starting today, the character is the same age, the character has essentially the same background, the same gender, the same sex, ethnicity, sexual preference, or sexual orientation. Is the story going to be written exactly the same way? Can you just substitute the place names, London and New York? Can you just substitute the names of the streets and the... Or should the prose actually change to reflect the fact that the setting has changed? The story type is the same, the narrative is the same, but the setting now is New York. So maybe you want to use prose that is flavored by New York. So New York slang being used instead of London slang, that you use American spelling, that you use American idiom, that the worldview of a character who has been born and raised in New York is going to be slightly different than the worldview of a character born and raised in London. That it will not necessarily be the same. So when they enter a room, they may notice different things in that room. When they meet other characters, they may judge them in slightly different ways because of the different cultures. And all of that can be reflected in the prose, because the narrative point of view, what the narrative is focusing on, what it is being described as, is what the prose is doing here. And that has to be reflected in the word choice. So you can see that narrative perspective here and central character are intrinsically linked to, in this instance at least, the prose. The prose is intrinsically linked to those things. You can't just go, the prose is X, because you have to have the consideration of setting, both the physical and sort of chronological or temporal setting, the central character, the point of view, and the style of story. So even if it is written in a journalistic style, the journalistic style of which newspaper, which reporter, that's going to change as well, because is it a sensationalist tabloid? Is it a serious newspaper with lots of very serious pondering editorials? What do you mean by reportage? And that is going to be a judgment call about the actual prose used to communicate this narrative. And that is straightforward mimetic fiction, where a lot of the world building and a lot of the things that need to be communicated to the reader can be assumed. Now, add in a supernatural element to that story. So still setting it in the modern day, starting today, still with the same protagonist, and add in a supernatural element suddenly coming into it. Should the prose ever change? You go, maybe. It depends, because if this character is now transitioning into a gothic horror, then maybe the language starts to slowly evolve and change over the novel, so that by the time that you reach the end, the physical prose on the page is different to the prose that it started with, because the character's point of view has shifted, the character's perspective has shifted, and everything is being tied into that. And that can then reflect a change in tone through the narrative, because the tone and the style are being reflected in the prose. Therefore, the prose is changing. It's moved from an editorial reportage, quite straightforward language, and it might slowly over time become more gothic, become more embellished as they descend deeper and deeper into this supernatural horror mystery. And that is one technique, because we can see the prose used on the page can be, depending on the narrative, heavily influenced by the narrative perspective. So for instance, if you have 4 point of view characters, and the first character is a very pompous, arrogant, elitist knight, they may view the world that way. So if their chapters are written from their perspective, not necessarily in first person, but focalized through them, then the prose might be written in a more stilted, formal style, because it reflects their character. So when the reader encounters those chapter sections and they read them, they get a sense of who that character is through the prose describing other things, because it is being flavored by the psychology and the character of the point of view character, even if it is not first person. And then what if the next character in the next chapter is this romantic poet who is in love with life and celebrating all these things? The prose might change again to be something far more languid, far more poetic, to reflect that characteristic. And then you can have someone who might be cold and emotionless, and that language might be very cold and sparse and matter of fact. All of these things can physically alter that prose on the page, but the author takes account of it and changes the type of prose that they are using. And that's just about character perspective. And now let's think about how events can change things. Because when we think about it, The prose on the page is a way of communicating pace. So if you have lots of big narrative events all the way through, lots of events, it's a page turning thing, it's an action thriller, there's action on every page, that can be exhausting for some readers. But what if the author wants to build up tension? Then what they might do is they start using slightly longer sentences, more words to a sentence, longer paragraphs, because that has this effect where the reader feels like things are slowing down because more time is taking place for the physical reading between the events happening. It's drawing things out, so it slows the reader down. Therefore, tension can be built up that when we get then to a moment of action and the author starts using much shorter words and shorter sentences and shorter paragraphs and shorter chapters, it suddenly becomes very page-turny again because lots of things are happening very, very quickly. And it feels like the pace accelerates. But essentially, you're still reading at roughly the same reading speed. It is your perception of pace that changes. And that is reflected in the prose. That is reflected in the word choice. That is reflected in the sentence and paragraph and chapter structures. So that's another way to create that effect that an author might choose to alter a prose style. And then we can get to the sense of genre and setting that I was talking about. Using the same language, say, for a far future military science fictional world and a rich fantasy world set sometime in the past that's about heroically slaying dragons. Do you use the same prose for both? Well, you can. Or you can maybe alter it that the language of science fiction, you can include more scientific terminology, more modern spellings of things, more modern sentence constructions and structures. You can use language that has a feeling of it being metallic and sharp and pointed and cold and clinical. That's one way of reflecting science fiction. And for fantasy, you might choose slightly archaic or slightly old-fashioned words. You might lengthen the sentences to give that more languid pace of the past. You might use terminology that we associate with the medieval period or sound like they should be associated with the medieval period. All of this in the actual prose to try to communicate and create a feeling of the fantasy world. And then if you took a chapter and you rewrote it in the science fictional language, what you might find is you have this softer language, more languid language, or language written in a certain style. And then the next chapter, if it was written in the science fictional style, would feel very different. It would be a radical contrast. And there's actually a fantasy story that does this, which is, I think it's the one I'm thinking of is The Wolf Age by James Eng. And in it, the character uses magic, but magic is essentially far future technology. So the language used to describe magic is all about tessellating things through the fourth dimension and setting up blah, blah, blah. It's all very scientific. It's all very rational. And that is in sharp contrast to the much more mythic language employed in the prose to describe everything else. And it reflects the fact that the magician character is actually from a different realm, is from a different reality. And any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. So the author is actually playing with that. So that you can see how it's about the effect that the author is trying to create, that may actually alter prose. So let's then think about authorial intent in terms of what they are doing. If an author is intending a story to be heavily influenced by philosophy or to investigate themes, they may not want to use a style of prose that they feel is more appropriate to an adventure story or an action story, because they want the reader to slow down. They want the reader to take their time with these concepts. And that is very, very different to the style that an author wants when a reader is rattling through an adventure story, because they don't necessarily want the reader to pause and think about the actions of the hero and whether or not they are truly heroic. They get caught up in the action. Those are two very different prose styles for very different effects because they are in different narratives. And if we judged a philosophical text by the criteria we use for an adventure story, the philosophical text is more than likely going to look badly written because it's not going to conform to those things. And vice versa. If we judged the action text with the criteria we developed from the philosophical text, then that text, the adventure text, is going to look very shallow and very poorly written because it's not spending enough time investigating things. But neither one is a true reflection of the prose serving the narrative. And this takes me on to this aspect about evaluating it, because a lot of narrative styles evolve over time. We see that with the Gothic period and a lot of the Gothic writing. We see it with the Victorian period and stylistics that evolved during Victorian writing, or even Romance writing. All of these different time periods led to specific styles becoming dominant. And one of the things that kind of evolved in the mid 20th century was this movement away, or movement toward a sort of Hemingway-esque, very clean, almost sterile language, that it was all about economy and paring everything down to its very base form. And you can see that exaggerated almost to the extreme in Cormac McCarthy's writing, which is like really exaggerating that sort of Hemingway-esque, paring everything back. And McCarthy uses it to very good effect for what he is trying to do with those stories. But that doesn't necessarily mean that this style is the best, the gold standard, because it's being used for a very particular purpose. And you can redeploy that purpose in multiple things. So from that, if we soften McCarthy style somewhat, we can look at it in terms of what's called sort of like the Windex style of writing, or the clear window style of writing, where the prose metaphorically vanishes and you are left with a very clean and clear and unambiguous view of what is going on in the narrative. That the author doesn't want you to concentrate on their language. They just want to communicate everything to you efficiently and effectively to get the story to you. And that is an exceptionally valid approach, but it's not the only approach. And if we judge everything based on that one particular style, what happens to all of the other different things that we want to read, all these other narratives? Suddenly they would become quite samey, because although you could change the characters and the events, stylistically they would become quite staid. And this is what we see happening in multiple time periods. As a dominant form emerges, it becomes the standard. It then is used all the time until someone comes up with a variant. That variant finds popularity, it gets elevated, it becomes the dominant form and standard. The other one now becomes old-fashioned, and so it continues. Thus has it ever been. So the clear window style is certainly one approach, but it's not the only approach, and it's not the only valid approach. And one of the ways of exploring this concept is if you think about, should a film soundtrack be recognizable as a separate element, or should it be subsumed into the film? And by this I mean, in certain films, you don't even remember when you step out of the theater. Like, hum one of the bits of the soundtrack and you go, I honestly can't think of it. But you know it had an effect. There were bits of the film where tension was building up, and you know that that's actually caused by the soundtrack interacting with and being communicated with aspects of things on the screen. You know there was a soundtrack, but you can't think of it. And then you think of other films that you come out of, and you can hum or the main themes of various characters, because each character has their own musical theme. That soundtrack was very obvious. It was very overt, as opposed to the other one, which was very covert and sort of subsumed into it. So which is the better style? You go, It depends on how they are being used. One style may be a preference for one filmmaker. The other style may be a preference for a different filmmaker. It doesn't mean that intrinsically one is better than the other. Some styles of that overt can feel very intrusive, and other times you can feel so engaged because as soon as that music starts, it's a cue and you get invested in the emotion. But other times it can throw you out of it because you go, God, that is so loud and it's so annoying, and it's so obnoxious. With the very, very covert thing, you end up thinking, well, I don't think anything about the soundtrack. I was completely unaware of it. And the filmmaker's going, yes, but it had that great effect. And they go, not really. I was really bored in that. Because people have different perceptions. So the idea that a clear, concise, precise, almost bland language, this very transparent language that isn't using subtext and poetic devices, is the gold standard, is not a position I would subscribe to. Because we can, authors use prose for all sorts of different effects. And when prose is used with intention, when that effect is achieved, to me, that is good prose. Not necessarily that it is one particular style. And so this brings us to, how do we evaluate it? And one of the things that feeds into all of this is our knowledge of different prose styles, our knowledge of different narrative styles, our knowledge of different genres and types of narrative. All of these things figure into what is good prose. It gives us a better handle on it. Because if we have expectations that a narrative functions in a certain way and that narrative is not functioning in that way, be it through its characterization, be it through its setting, be it through its language and prose, if it is rubbing against our expectations, we can read against it and therefore view it very negatively and not actually perceive what it is doing, what it is meant to be achieving, because we are actively resisting it. We are arguing against it. Whereas when we are familiar with lots of different styles, it doesn't matter what book you open, you will feel comfortable reading it because you are familiar with different prose styles, and therefore it doesn't feel alien, it doesn't feel strange. It's not going against your expectations because you don't have expectations that it must follow a certain thing. It can go, there are other things that can go against your expectations, but that's not the thing that throws you. Because when you're used to different prose styles, when you're used to different prose approaches, when you're used to different narrative styles and different narrative genres, you will always feel comfortable sliding into the book. And you will notice things that an author does differently. You will notice how they create their own unique narrative voice. So I hope you've enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.